In the heart of New York's Gilded Age, where fortunes glittered as brightly as the chandeliers of Fifth Avenue, a French artist steps into a house haunted by silence. Vivienne Rousseau has come to restore a portrait, but what she finds is a man imprisoned by marble memories and a past too heavy to breathe. Jonathan Wycliffe, a powerful tycoon, has buried his heart beneath duty and grief, until her brush awakens something he thought long dead. Secrets will resurface, guilt will burn, and love, quiet, forbidden, relentless, will demand its place among the ashes. Tell me, from where are you listening tonight? And do you still believe that love can bring the dead parts of our souls back to life? New York City, December of 1897. The streets shimmered beneath a light crust of snow, and the Hudson River swayed with the slow rhythm of winter. From the deck of a modest steamer, a woman stepped ashore wrapped in a dark woolen cloak trimmed in sable, a leather case pressed tightly to her side. Her name was Vivienne Rousseau. She moved with the elegance of someone taught to glide rather than walk, though her gloved hands trembled slightly from the cold. Her gray eyes remained alert, absorbing the unfamiliar grandeur of the city. She had left Paris with little more than her paints, her silence, and the bruised remains of a name once spoken with pride in French salons. That morning, a private carriage awaited her at the pier, its black lacquer gleaming beneath the dim sun. The driver, silent and impersonal, handed her a sealed envelope bearing the crest of the Wycliffe family. Inside was a single sentence: "The portrait must be restored before the new year." Nothing more. Fifth Avenue rose before her like a corridor of pride, its mansions somber and palatial, as if sculpted from ambition itself. At number 472, the carriage slowed. The Wycliffe residence stood tall, its wrought iron gates entwined with holly, though no lanterns glowed in welcome. Ivy clung to the stone like forgotten grief. Vivienne was escorted through the front doors by a stiff butler whose only words were this way: "Miss Rousseau." Inside, chandeliers loomed like frozen constellations, and polished marble floors echoed each careful step. Portraits lined the halls, faces of solemn men and pale women watching her as if to measure her worth. The air held the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and something older, something unspoken. In the portrait gallery, beneath a tall arched window veiled in lace, stood the canvas that had summoned her across the ocean. The painting was veiled in linen, dust gathered at the edges. She reached out and lifted the cloth. Her breath caught. It was a woman, elegant, poised, her features delicate and lifeless, eyes turned just slightly away, as if avoiding judgment. Time had cracked the surface, and smoke stains shadowed the lower frame. Vivienne knew instantly. This was no mere work of art. It was a memory enshrined, and the room was its tomb. Behind her, footsteps measured, heavy. She turned. Jonathan Wycliffe stood at the threshold, his tall figure silhouetted against the light of the hallway. His frock coat was immaculate, black over charcoal gray, his cravat knotted without flaw. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples, and his eyes, deep-set and unreadable, held her in silence. He did not offer his hand. "You'll be given a schedule. Meals are served privately. You'll have access to the eastern wing during daylight. That will be all." His voice was low, the tone of a man unaccustomed to pleasantries. Vivienne nodded, lowering her gaze. "Yes, Mr. Wycliffe." He lingered only a moment, then vanished without a sound. Left alone, Vivienne pressed her fingers to her throat. The silence pressed down like velvet and stone. She turned back to the painting, now her only companion in a house where time had stopped and warmth seemed forbidden. Later, in the small chamber assigned to her near the servants' corridor, she unpacked her brushes with care. The fire had not yet been lit, and her breath rose in faint white puffs. From her satchel she drew a folded sketch, the only thing she had saved from Paris. A memory, a face no one knew. That evening, snow began to fall. Quiet, slow, persistent. It blanketed the city in pale absolution, softening even the harshest corners. From the window of her room, Vivienne watched it gather on the railing. Somewhere down the hall, a clock struck 7. No footsteps, no voices. Only the ticking of time in a house wrapped in its own silence. And in the gallery, the portrait waited. So did the man who never spoke of what he had lost. The following morning, Vivienne awoke before dawn. A sliver of gray light slipped past the heavy brocade curtains of her small room. The air was sharp with cold, and the silence outside her door was absolute. She lit the oil lamp on her writing desk and with chilled fingers pinned her hair into a modest coil at the nape of her neck. Her dress for the day, a plum-colored wool gown with narrow sleeves and a high lace collar, was simple but dignified. She fastened a brooch at her throat, a small ivory rose carved by her father when she was a child, and slipped on her gloves. The house remained silent as she made her way to the eastern wing. The portrait hall greeted her like a crypt. The long room, with its vaulted ceiling and tall windows draped in sheer muslin, was bathed in pale morning light. Rows of ancestral faces hung along the walls, their gilded frames catching the shimmer of snow outside. And at the far end, beneath a canopy of shadow and light, awaited the portrait. Vivian approached it with the reverence of someone entering a chapel. She set down her case and began preparing her materials, brushes of varying softness, a small vial of lavender oil, pigments ground and sealed in tiny glass jars. She worked in silence, murmuring only to herself as she assessed the damage. A faint crack ran through the subject's right shoulder, and a shadow of age had dulled the once luminous ivory of her skin. Yet what unsettled Vivian most was the expression, calm, composed, and entirely absent of warmth. She reached for a brush and began the first cleansing strokes, each one delicate and exact. In the hush of the room she felt the weight of unseen eyes. The portrait seemed to watch her. But it wasn't only the painting. She sensed the presence of the woman it depicted, her perfume lingering faintly on the velvet curtains, her footsteps echoing down long-emptied corridors. By the second hour of work, the first visitor arrived. Mrs. Langford, the housekeeper, appeared with a tray of tea and a stern frown drawn deep across her brow. "Breakfast," she said flatly. "His instructions were that you are to remain here until midday. Lunch will be brought only if summoned." Vivian stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you. The room is very cold." Mrs. Langford raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "It's winter in New York. We do not heat the east wing unless necessary." Vivian nodded politely and returned to her stool. The woman lingered a moment, her sharp gaze sweeping over Vivian's tools and dress, and then, without another word, turned on her heel and departed. From then on, the days unfolded with a rhythm both isolating and strangely intimate. Vivian entered the gallery at 8 o'clock and worked until the sun passed beyond the tall windows. The butler brought tea. The maid, Lily, replaced the ashes in the fireplace, but none lingered long. The portrait commanded the room, and the room obeyed. What the servants would not say aloud, they murmured behind doors. Vivian heard them in the stillness of the stairwell, in the rustle of skirts near the kitchen. The Frenchwoman, hired to erase the past, too quiet to trust. Others, especially Lily, defended her. "She speaks kindly," the young maid whispered once to another, "and she never asked for anything." Jonathan Wickliffe remained an absence more than a presence. He rarely entered the gallery, but Vivian felt him in the brush of air when the doors opened, in the scent of tobacco that lingered when she arrived each morning. Occasionally his shadow appeared in the threshold, his tall frame still as stone, observing her without stepping inside. Their eyes met only once, briefly, across the length of the hall. No words passed between them. He disappeared before she could offer a greeting. But Vivian noticed things. She noticed how the portrait's gaze mirrored his own, distant, guarded, heavy with something unsaid. She noticed the way the paint had been layered too carefully around the mouth, as if the artist had tried to conceal a frown beneath softness. She noticed, too, how Jonathan's study remained lit late into the night, the flicker of his lamp visible from the window across the garden. One afternoon, as she restored the intricate detailing of the lady's collar, Vivian paused. There, beneath a worn patch near the neckline, she found an almost imperceptible alteration, paint that did not match the original pigment and brushstrokes less refined than the rest. She leaned closer. Someone had tried to erase a small pendant from the portrait, a locket it seemed. Only a faint outline remained. She did not touch it. Not yet. But the question nested in her mind. That evening she requested a few books from the butler on American portraiture for reference. He brought them without comment, though his eyes lingered on her face as if seeing her for the first time. In her room, Vivian read by lamplight, occasionally glancing toward the frost-laced window. The mansion loomed beyond, as silent and vast as a cathedral. Her thoughts wandered to the locket, to the delicate frown on the painted lips, and to Jonathan Wickliffe. She had encountered men like him in Paris, men of wealth, of power, who measured affection by its usefulness. But Jonathan was different. He wore his sorrow like a second coat. He lived among shadows not because he feared the light, but because the shadows had become familiar. On the fifth day, just after noon, she heard footsteps again. She turned, expecting Lily, but it was Jonathan. He stood inside the gallery now, closer than he had ever dared. His coat was buttoned, his gloves still on, as if he had not intended to stay. But his eyes did not move from the portrait. Vivian stood, waiting. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet from her. "You've made progress," he said quietly. She nodded. "Yes, sir." "The colors are beginning to return." He said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the painting, his jaw tense. "She was beautiful," Vivian offered softly. He replied without looking at her. "She was admired." Vivian hesitated, then returned to her stool. "There's a difference." His eyes flicked to her, then sharp, assessing. "What do you mean?" "Admiration is given, Icely. Beauty draws it, but being loved, being understood, that is different." He looked at her a moment longer, then turned back to the portrait. You speak as though you've known both. She did not answer. The silence between them stretched. I've read the papers, he added, his voice lower. About your family. Your brother. Vivian's spine stiffened. That was a long time ago. I didn't bring you here for your reputation, he said. Her eyes lifted to meet his. No, you brought me to restore hers. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, something like the first hairline crack in marble. Without another word, he turned and left the room. Vivian remained motionless, her heart pounding. She looked at the portrait again and felt the tension still alive in the painted face, the weight of what was never spoken. Then she dipped her brush and returned to her work, each stroke slower, each detail sharper, as if unearthing not just a likeness, but a secret. The snow continued outside, soft as memory, and in the stillness of the house something began to stir, something that could not yet be named, but pulsed beneath the surface like heat beneath frost. The storm rolled in without warning, its winds rattling the tall windows of the Wycliffe mansion and casting flickering shadows across its marble corridors. By the time night fell, the snowfall had thickened into a furious curtain of white, and thunder growled low above the Hudson River. The servants moved briskly, lighting more lamps than usual, checking the fireplaces, whispering of chimney drafts and creaking beams. The cold pressed harder through the stone walls as if the house itself recoiled from the weather. Vivian awoke to a sharp knock at her door just past 7 in the morning. Lily, pale and breathless, stood in the hallway, a shawl draped hastily over her shoulders. Miss Rousseau, she said, there's been an accident. A pipe burst in the east wing during the night. The portrait hall is flooded. Vivian blinked, still adjusting to the early hour. Flooded? Yes, miss. The ceiling over the windows cracked. Water everywhere. The staff is clearing it, but Mr. Wycliffe says you are to relocate your work immediately. Relocate? To where? Lily hesitated, eyes widening. To his private study. Vivian felt her breath catch. In all her days at the mansion, she had never stepped foot inside that room. She had passed by its heavy oak doors on occasion, catching the faint scent of cigar smoke and leather-bound volumes. But it remained forbidden, a sanctuary of masculine silence and withdrawn thought, that Jonathan Wycliffe would invite her into that space. She tightened her shawl and followed Lily down the hall. The study was on the west side of the mansion, overlooking a secluded portion of the garden now buried in snow. It was a room of rich woods and warm shadows lined from floor to ceiling with shelves of books, their spines gold-stamped and worn. A grand desk stood near the window, framed by tall curtains of midnight blue velvet. To the right, a leather settee faced the hearth, where flames now crackled softly. The scent of tobacco lingered faintly, but no cigar was in sight. It was a room of solitude, of memory. Jonathan stood beside the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a deep navy morning coat tailored to his broad frame, and a dark gray cravat pinned with a single pearl. He turned as she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. My apologies for the disruption, he said at last, his voice lower than usual, softened perhaps by the intimacy of the space. I trust the maid explained? She did, Vivian replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. Shall I set up near the window? He gave a brief nod. There's adequate light there by noon. If you require anything, ask the butler directly. I'll try to remain out of your way. And with that, he stepped aside and resumed reading a folder of documents, though she noticed his eyes did not return to the pages. Vivian unpacked her materials in silence, arranging them atop a side table brought in for her use. She positioned the portrait carefully on its easel and adjusted the drape of linen across the back to shield it from the fire's warmth. The painting seemed different in this setting, more exposed, more personal. It looked out of place among the volumes of poetry, maps of distant lands, and the framed daguerreotype of a woman's hand resting atop a leather-bound book. For several hours, no words passed between them. She worked with steady hands, pausing only to sip the tea brought to her by a maid. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, only the occasional sound of turning pages or the soft crackle of the fire broke the stillness. But the air between them shifted imperceptibly at first, then with growing clarity. She was aware of him in a new way, not as the distant figure who owned the house, but as a man carved by loss, his silences heavier than words. Near midday, Jonathan rose and approached the window, gazing out at the snow-covered garden. You lived in Paris? He asked, not turning. I did, Vivian replied, surprised by the sudden question. For many years. I spent 2 winters there after the war. The city never seemed to sleep, she smiled faintly. It still doesn't, though sleep often feels like mercy. He turned then, slowly, leaning one hand against the edge of the desk. Did you study there? Yes. At the École des Beaux-Arts, though I was not officially admitted. A friend of my father arranged for a private tutor. I learned more from the galleries than any classroom. He nodded. And now you paint the past. I try to preserve it, she said gently. Though some memories resist restoration, his gaze dropped to the portrait. Yes, some do. A pause. Then he added, almost to himself, she was ambitious. People don't remember that about her. They recall her beauty, her dresses, her voice at the theater, but she wanted more than drawing rooms and dinners. She had opinions, dangerous ones, they said. Political? Vivian asked. In a way. She spoke out where silence was expected. It was admirable, but difficult. Vivian returned her eyes to the canvas, to the delicate features that still bore traces of mystery. She doesn't look at the viewer. She looks away. That's uncommon in portraits of this kind. Jonathan approached slowly, standing behind her, though not too close. Perhaps she didn't want to be seen too clearly. Or perhaps, Vivian said softly, she didn't want to see the person standing before her. He looked down at her then, and for a fleeting instant, their eyes met. There was no smile, no overt softness, but something moved behind his gaze. A recognition, perhaps, or the first stirrings of something unnamed. Vivian lowered her brush. Would you mind, she said carefully, if I examined the frame? I believe there's something lodged behind it, possibly part of the original sketch. Go ahead, he said, his voice more guarded now. She stepped around the easel and knelt beside the lower edge of the frame. With delicate fingers, she lifted the edge of the canvas just enough to slide her hand behind. Something crinkled, a slip of paper, old and thin. She drew it out slowly, her heart beginning to pound. It was a letter, folded once, yellowed with age, sealed with wax now broken. There was no name, no date, only a faint monogram on the top corner. Vivian rose to her feet, unsure whether to speak. She glanced at Jonathan. He watched her, his brow slightly furrowed. What is it? I believe it belonged to her, she said carefully. It was hidden in the back. I haven't opened it. He held out his hand. Vivian hesitated only a moment before placing it in his palm. Their fingers brushed, just briefly, but the touch lingered in her skin long after he stepped away. Jonathan walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to her. The flames cast his shadow against the paneled wall. He did not open the letter. Leave it with me, he said quietly. That will be all for today, Vivian nodded, her throat suddenly tight. She gathered her brushes and closed the lid of her case. As she passed the door, she looked back once. Jonathan stood unmoving, the letter in his hand, the portrait watching from the corner. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting. But within the study, something had shifted, not enough to be named, but enough to be felt. A letter hidden, a gaze averted, a silence broken. And in the hallway beyond, only whispers remained. The invitation arrived not in an envelope, but through the dry voice of Mrs. Langford, who appeared in Vivian's doorway with a silver tray balanced against one hip, and her expression stiff as starch. Mr. Wycliffe is hosting a winter gala this evening, the housekeeper said without inflection. Philanthropy and appearances. He's asked that you be present, just for the beginning. Vivian looked up from her sketches, startled. Me? Mrs.? Langford's lips tightened. I don't presume to understand why. Vivian hesitated, unsure. I have nothing suitable to wear. I've left something on the bed. It belonged to the late Mrs. Wycliffe. With your figure, it should fit well enough. Before she could protest, the woman had turned and walked away. Vivian remained still for a moment, her pulse fluttering. Then, with careful fingers, she approached the bed. There, laid out on the coverlet like an offering or a test, was a gown of deep sapphire blue. The bodice was adorned with delicate jet beading, the sleeves sheer and tapered, the skirt full but not ostentatious. It was the kind of gown meant to be worn beneath candlelight and gazes. She touched the fabric gently. The late mistress's scent had long faded, but Vivian could feel the weight of memory in every stitch. She dressed slowly, her heart caught between discomfort and disbelief. Lily arrived to help pin her hair, pulling the soft chestnut strands into a twisted chignon, allowing a few tendrils to fall loose around her face. You look like a lady from one of those French paintings, Lily whispered with admiration. Vivian smiled faintly. Let's hope I'm treated as one. That evening, the mansion was transformed. Gaslight sconces flickered like stars along the staircases, and the chandeliers above the grand ballroom glowed with hundreds of flame-tipped bulbs. Garlands of holly and gold ribbon wrapped the columns, and a quartet played near the arched windows, their music weaving through conversations and clinking glasses. Guests in silks and velvets filled the room, bankers, opera patrons, politicians, and their jeweled wives. Every movement was polished, every laugh carefully timed. Beneath the surface, the evening pulsed with performance. Vivian descended the main staircase slowly, her gloved hand grazing the banister. She could feel their eyes before she saw them, the curious, the judgmental, the cruelly amused. She moved through the crowd like a shadow among lanterns, nodding when necessary but avoiding extended conversation. Jonathan stood near the fireplace, surrounded by a cluster of admirers and allies. He wore a black tailcoat and white cravat, and even from across the room his presence silenced others. When his eyes found hers, they did not linger. He turned back to his conversation as though she had not entered. Still, Vivian could feel it, the awareness that passed between them like a thread drawn taut and seen but unbreakable. "Is that her?" a woman whispered near the refreshment table. "The one restoring the portrait. I heard she was exiled from France. Something about her brother and a failed uprising. She's a fallen aristocrat. That's what they say." Vivian kept her spine straight, her expression calm, but the air was stifling, thick with perfume and half-truths. She drifted toward the side of the room where a small alcove offered temporary shelter. From there she watched the gathering unfold, Jonathan laughing lightly at a comment, his hand resting briefly on a guest's shoulder, his expression practiced and smooth. And then from the crowd a voice rose, sharp, feminine, confident. "Vivian Rousseau?" Vivian turned. A tall, statuesque woman approached her, dark-haired and gloved in white. Her gown shimmered with silver embroidery and a fan rested delicately against her chest. "You are Vivian Rousseau, are you not?" the woman asked again, though her tone made it clear she already knew the answer. Vivian inclined her head politely. "Yes, I thought I recognized you. I believe we once met in Paris at the Salon de la Société des Artistes." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "I was there the night the gendarmes arrived." What a scandal. Around them a few guests turned their heads, scenting blood. Vivian met her gaze with calm. Scandal fades faster than truth. The woman arched an eyebrow. "Does it?" Before more could be said, another voice cut through the murmur. "That will be enough, Mrs. Pembroke." The crowd shifted as Jonathan stepped forward. He had not raised his voice, but the authority in it quieted the room. He looked at Vivian only briefly before turning to the socialite. "You're a guest in my home. I expect better manners than what I've just heard." Mrs. Pembroke flushed and her mouth tightened. "My apologies, Mr. Wycliffe, I meant no offense." He said nothing further, only nodded once and walked away. Vivian's hands trembled slightly. She drew a breath and retreated from the ballroom, her steps light and soundless against the marble. She climbed the staircase with measured grace, and once at the top, turned not toward her room, but toward the east wing. The portrait hall was dark, lit only by a single candelabra left burning near the far wall. The air was colder here, untouched by the heat and revelry below. She moved to stand before the painting once more, as though the stillness might restore her balance. She didn't hear his steps until he was close. "You left the ballroom," Jonathan said quietly. Vivian turned slowly. He stood at the threshold again, but this time he stepped forward. "I needed air," she said, "and quiet." His eyes searched her face. "You didn't deserve that. I've been treated worse. That doesn't excuse it." A pause. "She was wrong," he added, voice low. "Truth doesn't fade." Vivian looked down at her gloved hands. "Neither do some wounds." He took another step forward. In the flicker of candlelight, his face looked different, less guarded, more human. The lines around his mouth were not hardened by arrogance, but shaped by restraint. "You shouldn't hide in shadows," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something fragile beneath its depth. "That isn't where you belong." Vivian raised her gaze. The emotion between them was no longer vague. It pulsed, soft, steady, undeniable. His hand lifted slightly, hesitantly, and then with the gentlest touch he brushed the edge of her wrist through the glove. A breath, a second, and then, as if startled by his own boldness, he pulled away. Neither of them spoke. He turned and left, his footsteps fading down the hall. Vivian remained where she stood, the warmth of his touch still echoing along her skin, though the fire had not touched her. Below, the music continued, and the guests drank, and laughter rose like a masquerade hiding the grief of the house. But in the hall of forgotten faces, something quiet and tremulous had awakened, too fragile to name, too real to deny. The days that followed the gala seemed quieter, though the house remained as silent as ever. Something had shifted, not in the walls nor in the air, but in the way Vivian now occupied the space. She no longer moved as if tiptoeing through someone else's memories. She stepped into the portrait hall with measured purpose, and though her glances toward the door remained cautious, they carried a different tension now, one not born of fear but of awareness. Jonathan Wycliffe had not spoken to her since that night in the hall. He passed occasionally along the upper landing, his footfall steady, his expression unreadable. But when he did appear, even if only for a moment, the room felt altered by his presence. And when he didn't come, the absence left a mark even heavier than before. On the third morning, just as the sun began to cut pale gold through the tall windows, she heard his voice behind her once again. "I dreamt about her last night." Vivian turned slowly. Jonathan stood near the doorway, his coat unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened, a rare sign of fatigue on a man so controlled. He looked not at the portrait but at the floor. She was wearing the green dress, he said. The one with the lace at the sleeves. She used to wear it when we visited Newport. I hadn't thought about it in years. Vivian set down her brush and straightened. Dreams tend to bring back what we try to forget. He gave a faint, hollow laugh. I haven't forgotten, I've just tried to reshape it, carve out the sharp parts. She said nothing. He walked farther into the room, his steps slow, deliberate. It's painting, he said, stopping before the canvas was meant to preserve her, but now, I don't know. It feels like a monument to something that never truly existed. Vivian hesitated. Did you love her? He turned his head slightly, not facing her. I believed I did. I think I still do. But the version I remember, she wasn't real. Or perhaps I never truly saw her. He paused, then looked directly at Vivian. That frightens me more than anything else. The confession hung in the air like breath in winter. Vivian's throat tightened. She was admired, she said softly. But admiration often asks nothing of us. Love requires we see the person in full. Jonathan's jaw flexed slightly, his eyes narrowing with thought. She was clever, brilliant at times, but always just beyond reach. I could never quite meet her where she stood. He took a deep breath, stepping closer to the portrait. This room used to comfort me. Now it feels like a courtroom. Vivian lowered her gaze. In that moment, the decision she had avoided for days came crashing upon her like cold water. She walked slowly to her satchel and drew out the folded letter. Its edges had yellowed further since the day she discovered it. She turned it in her hands once, twice, then stepped toward him. I found this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was hidden behind the frame. I haven't read it, but I think you should. Jonathan's eyes dropped to the letter. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked at her face, searching as if trying to gauge her motives. Why give it to me now? Because you've stopped hiding. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the silence between them became a bridge. It's not yet crossed, but strong enough to hold weight. He took the letter. His fingers brushed hers briefly, but enough to draw the breath from her lungs. Without another word, he turned and left the room. That evening the snow returned, light at first, then heavier as night fell. Vivian stood at the tall window of her chamber, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching as flakes danced beneath the gaslights of the street below. She had not seen Jonathan since the morning. His valet had passed by twice, once delivering a message to the butler, once to speak with Mrs. Langford. But of Jonathan there had been no sign, until now. Through the veil of snow and shadow she saw him. Jonathan, coat collar turned high, gloves in hand, walking slowly down the front steps of the mansion and into the street. He did not take the waiting carriage. He did not speak to the doorman. He walked, alone, into the winter. Vivian pressed her palm to the cold glass. The ache that bloomed in her chest startled her with its force. She did not move away until he disappeared around the corner. Hours passed. She could not sleep. The wind sighed against the windows, and somewhere downstairs a grandfather clock marked the time with slow, steady chimes. When she finally drifted into rest, it was with the image of him burned into her mind, his tall frame swallowed by snow, his silence echoing louder than any words. The following morning she returned to the portrait hall early. The canvas waited in silence, but it no longer intimidated her. She approached it with a kind of reverence she hadn't known before, not for the woman it depicted, but for the truth it concealed. She took up her brush and dipped it into the muted tones of ochre and cream. Her strokes were slow, deliberate. She retouched the edges of the neckline, softened the shadows beneath the jawline, but did not alter the mouth. That slight downturn remained unresolved. As the hours passed, she paused, often gazing, not at the paint, but at the hollow of space between the woman's eyes and the viewer. That blankness was no longer neutral. It questioned. It challenged. Just before noon, a sound behind her drew her attention. She turned. Jonathan stood there. His coat was dusted with snow, his hair slightly tousled. But what struck her most was the stillness in his expression, calm, quiet, and deeply altered. He didn't speak at first. He stepped into the room and walked directly to the fireplace, where he stood with one hand on the mantel. She wrote it 2 weeks before she died, he said finally. She was planning to leave. Vivian's breath caught. It wasn't cruel, he added, not angry. She said she didn't blame me, that she just didn't know how to live in the life we'd built. He turned then, facing her fully. She felt unseen, like she had become a symbol, a perfect wife for a man the city respected. But she had no voice in that role. She was vanishing. Vivian's eyes burned with unshed tears. I'm sorry, I'm not, he said, and his voice, though steady, trembled at its edges. Not anymore. Because for the first time since she passed, I understand her, and I can stop trying to worship her memory. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just before her. You gave me that letter knowing it would wound me. Vivian held his gaze. Yes. Why? Because a man who lives behind marble cannot feel. And you were suffocating in stone. A breath passed between them, warm in the cold air. He reached out then, his hand hovering near her cheek, not quite touching. You see too much, he murmured. And yet not enough, she replied, her voice cracking. But the touch never came. He lowered his hand, turned, and walked away. Vivian remained still for a long time. Not because she was afraid, but because something within her had changed. She was no longer merely a guest in a grand and grieving house. She was a witness to a man breaking for the first time, not in silence, but in truth. The snow had begun to melt, but the cold remained. February in New York carried a dampness that settled deep into the bones, the kind of cold that no fire could entirely chase away. The Wycliffe mansion stood as ever silent, composed, as if its very walls were trained to mask emotion. But beneath its polished exterior, tension stirred like a storm beneath calm waters. Vivian noticed it first in the shift of the servants. Lily, once cheerful in her quiet way, now moved with glances over her shoulder. Mrs. Langford spoke less, and when she did, her tone carried a sharper edge. Footsteps echoed louder. Doors opened and closed with less grace. It was on the morning of the third Thursday of the month that Mrs. Cornelia Ashcroft arrived without notice. The carriage rolled up just before 10 o'clock, its glossy sides bearing the faint emblem of the Ashcroft estate. The butler greeted her stiffly, and within moments the air in the house changed. Vivian, working quietly in the gallery, heard the sound of heels tapping across the marble, steady and imperious. Cornelia Ashcroft was a woman of calculated elegance. Her coat was trimmed with fox fur, her hat adorned with black plumes, and her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. She had the air of someone who had never been denied entry, who believed every space owed her deference simply for existing in it. She entered the portrait hall unannounced, flanked by silence and a faint scent of bergamot. "So it's true," she said without greeting, surveying the room. "You've turned her resting place into a workroom." Vivian rose, brushing her hands down her skirt. "Mrs. Ashcroft, I wasn't aware you would be visiting." Cornelia gave her a glance that lingered just long enough to be unkind. "No one was, and yet here I am. I've come to see what remains of my cousin's legacy. I find it curious that my invitation was delayed, while yours seems to have been sent express from across the ocean." Vivian said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be twisted in her mouth. Cornelia circled the room slowly, stopping before the nearly restored portrait. "She looks distant," she murmured. "I suppose that was always true. But even now something is missing." She turned. "Do you know what that is, Miss Rousseau?" Vivian met her gaze, steady but cautious. "I don't presume to know." "It's her power," Cornelia said. "And I fear you are here to erase it." Before Vivian could respond, Jonathan entered. His presence shifted the room instantly. He was composed as always, but his eyes flickered first to Vivian, then to the painting, then to Cornelia. "Cornelia," he said with a nod. "I see you've found your way inside." She smiled coolly. "I never needed an invitation, Jonathan. You do now." Her smile thinned. "We should speak privately." Jonathan gestured to the hallway, and the two of them left. Vivian stood for several minutes in the silence that followed, her heartbeat unsteady, her hands trembling slightly as she returned to her work. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to lower behind the city rooftops, Cornelia found her again, this time in the side garden where Vivian had gone seeking air. The snow was patchy on the stone path, and the bare branches reached skyward like pleading arms. "You must understand," Cornelia said, drawing her fur stole tighter, "that I have nothing against you personally, but your presence here raises eyebrows. Questions." Vivian turned slowly. "What sort of questions?" "Oh, the usual." Cornelia's voice was smooth. How a foreign artist of diminished fortune comes to live in the home of a widowed tycoon. How she gains access to rooms even the family rarely sees. How she discovers private letters and keeps them secret. Vivian's breath stilled. "I haven't shared the letter," she said. "No, but I have," Cornelia replied, her tone almost amused. "Not its contents, of course, only its existence. Imagine what the society pages would do with even that." Vivian's face paled. "You threaten him." "I protect him," Cornelia corrected. "From you. From your ambitions. Don't look surprised. Women like you, with nothing left, always come with quiet intentions and hidden hopes." Vivian took a step forward, her voice firm. "I came to restore a painting. I didn't come for his heart." Cornelia arched an eyebrow. "But you've touched it, haven't you? And hearts, Miss Rousseau, are far more fragile than canvas." That night, Vivian packed her belongings. She moved slowly, carefully folding her few garments into her worn satchel. She wrapped her brushes in linen, tied them with twine. Her hands moved with determination, but her chest ached with every motion. She didn't belong here. She never had. But just as she reached for her coat, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Jonathan. He said nothing at first. His eyes dropped to the satchel, then lifted to her face. "You're leaving." "I should have left long ago." Because of Cornelia? Because this house was not built to hold truth, only memory. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I asked you to stay, he said. When the letter came to light, when the portrait stirred what I didn't want to see, you remained. Even when you could have walked away. I stayed for her, Vivian said. Not for you. He didn't flinch. And now? Vivian turned her back to him. Now I'm in the way. Of your peace. Of your name. Jonathan crossed the room slowly. His voice, when it came again, was not cold, it was wounded. Don't you see what you've done to me? She turned then, her eyes wet, but her spine straight. I never wanted to do anything to you, I only wanted to finish the work. He took a step forward. But the work is not the painting anymore, Vivian. Silence pressed between them. And then, without warning, without permission, without a plan, he kissed her. It was not soft. It was not chaste. It was a kiss that spoke of loneliness, of grief, of the unbearable burden of restraint. It was desperate and furious and tender, all at once. His hands barely touched her arms, but the heat between them was searing. She gasped against his mouth, her breath stolen not by surprise, but by the truth that it had already lived inside her. Then, as quickly as it had begun, she broke away. No, she whispered, eyes wide. We can't. Vivian. She shook her head, stumbling back. I'm not the woman you lost, and I won't be the one they blame. She turned and fled from the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, her breath ragged as she disappeared down the hall. Jonathan remained where he was, his chest rising and falling. His heart fractured once more, not by death, but by something far more cruel. Hope. The house grew colder in the days that followed. Not because of the weather, the early March winds had softened, and the city outside bloomed with the promise of thaw, but because of the silence that settled between Vivian and Jonathan like a pane of frost between two warm hands. Vivian kept to herself, retreating into the portrait hall each morning with quiet purpose. She no longer lingered in corridors. She no longer spoke to the staff beyond what was necessary. She no longer allowed her gaze to drift toward the western wing where Jonathan's study waited behind closed doors. Her brushes moved with mechanical precision now, her hands obeyed. Her heart did not. The portrait was nearly complete. The final layers required the lightest of touches, a softening of the background, a hint of reflection in the eyes, a feathered shadow beneath the collarbone. Yet Vivian worked slowly, as though the end of the task might force her to leave something she was not ready to release. She spent long hours seated before the canvas, not just restoring color, but studying the woman it immortalized. The face was elegant, the posture serene, but behind the painted stillness, Vivian now saw something she had missed before. A tension in the mouth, a flicker of sorrow just beyond the brushstroke, a truth too long buried beneath layers of admiration. Jonathan, for his part, kept his distance. They passed only once in the corridor 3 days after the kiss. He nodded, she lowered her gaze. No words were exchanged. But the air between them pulsed like a wound. It was on the evening of the 5th day that it happened. Vivian had remained later than usual, adjusting a delicate highlight near the portrait's left shoulder. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the last servants had retired to the lower levels of the house. The silence was complete, save for the occasional creak of wood or whisper of wind against the glass. She lit a second oil lamp, placing it on the opposite side of the easel to balance the light. She did not see the thin strand of smoke curling upward from the faulty sconce on the far wall. The fire caught in an instant. A spark, a hiss, a sudden whoosh of flame across old drapery. Vivian turned at the sound, her breath caught in her throat. Within seconds, smoke billowed into the room, black and acrid. The flames climbed the curtain like vines, reaching for the ceiling. She moved toward the door, but the smoke blinded her. Her foot struck a stool, and she stumbled, hitting the floor hard. Gasping, she crawled toward the faint outline of the doorway, heat licking at her back. Her eyes burned. The air thickened. And then, through the blur and the smoke, his voice. Vivian. She tried to answer, but no sound escaped her lungs. Heavy footsteps. The door burst open. A rush of cold air, and then Armstrong, urgent, trapped around her. She felt herself lifted, cradled against a chest that trembled not with fear but fury. Jonathan carried her into the hallway and down the staircase, past startled servants and the shouts of the butler calling for water. Only when they reached the library did he stop, placing her gently onto the velvet settee. Vivian coughed violently, pressing a hand to her chest. Her hair had come loose, strands clinging to her damp face. Her gown was streaked with ash. Jonathan knelt before her, his hands at her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still unable to speak. He looked at her for a long moment, then rose and poured a glass of water from the sideboard. She drank in trembling sips. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant clatter of servants extinguishing the flames. Finally, she spoke. "The portrait, it's gone," he said, voice low. She closed her eyes. Jonathan sat beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she felt his presence like a second heartbeat. "I failed," she whispered. "No," he said fiercely. "I did." She looked at him. He met her gaze. "Kept that painting not to remember her, but to punish myself. To keep my guilt framed in gold and hanging on the wall where I could see it every day." Vivian's breath hitched. "She didn't belong on that wall," he continued. "Neither do you." She shook her head, tears brimming. "Don't say that. I've hidden in shadows too long," he said. "But with you, I began to see things clearly again. And it terrifies me." She stared at him, unable to look away. "I felt alive again," he confessed, voice rough. "I felt seen." Vivian turned away, blinking fast. "But it's too late." He nodded slowly. "Yes, and too dangerous." Silence settled once more. Not cold this time, but aching, honest. When she stood to leave, he did not stop her. That night, Vivian did not sleep. She sat at her desk beneath the flickering lamp, the scent of smoke still lingering in her hair. She opened her sketchbook and turned to a blank page. With delicate, deliberate strokes, she began to draw not the late wife, not the ruined portrait, but Jonathan. Not as society saw him, not as the stoic tycoon or the grieving widower, but as he had appeared that night, coat open, hair mussed, eyes full of something too raw to name. She drew the line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows, the tension in his shoulders, the weight of loss etched into every crease, but also the quiet beneath it, the vulnerability he never allowed to surface in daylight. She worked through the night, each line drawn with care, each shadow layered with memory. When dawn came, the sketch remained unfinished but alive. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Jonathan passed by her door just before sunrise. Unable to sleep, drawn by instinct or something deeper. The door was ajar, and in the lamplight he saw her head bent over the sketchbook, eyes focused, face soft with something that looked too much like love. He did not enter, he did not speak, but he saw. And in seeing, something inside him broke further still. The fire had destroyed the portrait. But in its place, something else had begun to form, not a memory but a truth, not a ghost but a choice. And though neither of them said the words aloud, both knew what burned was only canvas. What remained was far more dangerous. The storm arrived before dawn, swift, punishing, and uninvited. Thick snow descended over New York like a shroud, erasing the edges of the city in a silent fury. The gas lamps flickered dimly behind veils of white, and carriages moved slower through the slush, their wheels silenced beneath the weight of winter. But inside the Wycliffe mansion, it was not the snow that stilled the house. It was the news. By mid-morning, the butler had received a discreet package wrapped in cream-colored paper, hand-delivered by a boy with red cheeks and a wool cap. It was addressed to Jonathan. Inside, 3 clipped columns from the society pages of the city's most widely read newspaper. Jonathan stood in his study, the fire unlit, the light from the window cold and gray as he read the inked words printed beneath a headline that twisted like a blade. A widow's secret, sand her successor's games. The piece was crafted with cruel elegance, a whisper dressed as inquiry. It referred not by name but by insinuation, painting a picture of a grieving tycoon, his late wife's carefully curated image shattered by a newly surfaced letter, a letter suggesting disloyalty, disappointment, and a desire to leave her marriage. The article then shifted focus, describing an unnamed European restoration artist now living under the tycoon's roof, who had discovered this damning artifact. It asked questions, not directly but suggestively. Had the artist come to restore more than a portrait? Was it artistry or opportunity that brought her to Fifth Avenue? And was the tycoon mourning his wife for replacing her? Jonathan set the paper down and pressed his palm to his temple. The silence of the room rang with the echo of betrayal. Not from Vivian, from Cornelia. He knew her tactics too well, always careful, always just within the law, always just outside decency. A knock came at the study door. It was Philip Carter, one of his longest-standing board members. "We need to talk," the older man said, closing the door behind him with a heaviness that matched the moment. "You've seen it, I assume?" Jonathan nodded. "The others have as well. There was a meeting scheduled for next week, but several are asking to move it forward." Jonathan's voice was calm but hollow. "Because of rumors. Because of appearances," Philip replied. "We know you, but investors don't deal in character. They deal in perception, and right now that perception is bleeding." Jonathan remained silent. Philip hesitated, then added gently, "They're asking if she's still in the house." The words hung in the air like frost on glass. That evening, Vivian stood in the gallery, what remained of it. The room still bore the scent of soot, the scarred wallpaper and blackened wood panels, reminders of the fire that had nearly consumed it all. The easel had been moved to a corner and most of the paintings had been removed for cleaning. Only the empty frame remained, hung back on the wall with quiet reverence. She looked at it one last time. The footsteps behind her didn't startle her. She had known he would come. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his coat draped over one arm. For a moment he said nothing. Then softly, "It's all over the papers." Vivian didn't answer. They twisted everything. "Your presence. The letter. Even." He trailed off. She finally turned to face him. "I know." He stepped closer. "I can control the board. I can withstand the scandal. But I can't protect you from the city." She met his eyes, steady but tender. "You're not meant to." He took another breath. "They'll use this against you. Against everything you've worked to build." "And what do you suggest?" she asked, voice barely audible. A beat passed. "Leave," he said. "Leave the house. Not because I want you gone, but because I can't watch them tear you apart for being near me." Vivian stood very still. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from sorrow long anticipated. "So this is the end of it." Jonathan's voice broke slightly. "This is the only way I can protect what matters." Vivian nodded. She said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. She returned to her chamber and packed slowly. She folded her skirts, her gloves, her brushes. She wrapped the half-used sketchbooks in linen and slid them into her satchel. She dressed in a simple traveling gown of deep burgundy and gathered her hair into a low, loose knot. But before she closed the case, she pulled out one last page. The sketch. Jonathan, as she had seen him through the haze of firelight and confession. No cravat, no coat. His face unguarded. The sorrow and strength that warred within him, etched into every shadowed line. She placed it on his desk in the study, atop the unread newspapers and beside the empty crystal decanter. Then she left, without a word, just as the first flakes of the blizzard began to fall. Jonathan found the drawing long after the house had gone quiet again. He stood before it, eyes tracing the curve of the jaw, the weight in the eyes. He didn't touch it. He didn't sit. He simply stared. And then he walked to the fireplace. On the mantel still stood the original portraits, inged but intact, the last remnant of a life now blurred by time and illusion. He took it down slowly. He held it in his hands for a long moment, the weight familiar and foreign. Then he laid it in the hearth. The flames caught quickly. The canvas curled, darkened, and crumbled into ash. The face disappeared first, followed by the gold frame that had once held it all together. Only when the fire had died did he speak. Just one word, spoken into the silence like a prayer. "Enough." Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the city in white. The carriages halted. The gas lamps dimmed beneath the frost. And the mansion on Fifth Avenue, for the first time in years, stood truly empty. Not of people, of the past. The snow had melted, leaving the streets of Brooklyn lined with puddles and the promise of spring. Slush clung to the soles of boots and the hems of skirts, but the air had softened. It no longer carried the sharp bite of winter, only its memory. And within the narrow second-story studio on the corner of Myrtle Avenue, Vivian Rousseau painted in silence. Her workspace was modest, almost bare, but it was hers. The walls were pale and unadorned, the windows tall and streaked with the remains of the storm. A single stove warmed the room, and beside it her easel stood as sentinel. She had begun a new commission, the weak Priara portrait of an aging merchant's daughter in a satin christening gown, but her mind wandered as her brush hovered above the canvas. She no longer wore the gowns of Fifth Avenue, only simple cotton blouses and wool skirts. Her hands, once gloved in velvet, were now smudged with pigment and varnish. And her name, once whispered in scandalous tones behind golden fans, had faded into the murmur of the city. It was how she preferred it. Still, there were moments, quiet, unspoken moments, when she would pause in her work and close her eyes. And in that stillness she would remember the sound of his voice, the way he said her name as if it were fragile, the weight of silence between them in that last parting. She had not seen Jonathan Wycliffe in many weeks, not since the snowstorm, not since she left the mansion with her satchel and her silence. She had heard things, of course, that the board had moved forward without him, that he had withdrawn from public affairs, that his name no longer appeared in the city's business columns. But the gossip she ignored. She had no place for it now. She had chosen distance, and she had clung to it like a rope in stormy waters. It was near the end of March, on a gray morning touched by drizzle, when the knock came. She opened the door to find a familiar face, Mr. Rowan, Jonathan's valet. He was older than she remembered, though perhaps it was the weight of the message he carried that added the years to his posture. "Miss Rousseau," he said gently, removing his hat. "Mr. Wycliffe has asked me to deliver this to you personally." He held out a sealed envelope, thick, cream-colored, with her name written in black, inelegant, unmistakably his. Vivian thanked him, but he offered no explanations, only a quiet nod before descending the stairs and disappearing into the morning mist. She stood motionless for a long time before breaking the seal. Inside, a single page. Miss Rousseau, if you are able and willing, I would ask you to attend the opening of a new exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art this Thursday, just past dusk. Your presence would be most welcome. No name will be spoken. No past will be weighed. Only art, and what remains. Yours, Jawa. Her hands trembled slightly as she refolded the page. She told no one she was going. She dressed in silence, choosing a gown of dark plum, simple and modest, paired with a hat that veiled half her face. She arrived just as the museum's great bronze doors were opened to the first guests, her steps hesitant, her heart unsteady. The main gallery was lit with golden sconces and oil lamps that flickered against the marble columns. Music drifted softly through the corridors, and the scent of old paper and varnish filled the air. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of distant nobles, mythic scenes, and forgotten landscapes. But her eyes scanned not for them. They searched for him. She wandered slowly through the exhibit. And then in the final room, where the lights were dimmer and the crowd thinner, she saw it. On a panel of dark blue velvet hung a sketch, hers. It was the one she had left on his desk. Jonathan's face, rendered in charcoal and shadow, stared back at her. But not as the Tycoon of reputation. Not the man in starched collars and cold meetings. No, this was the man she had seen by firelight. The man who had saved her. The man who had broken. The plaque beneath it read, untitled. Donated anonymously. She did not realize she had stopped breathing until his voice reached her. You captured me too well. She turned. He stood beside her, tall and composed, dressed in a dark three-piece suit without a cravat. He looked older, perhaps, but more at ease. The tension that once lived in his shoulders had softened, though his eyes, those gray-blue eyes, held the same gravity. You shouldn't have shown it, she whispered. I didn't, he said. I gave it to the museum. They decided to display it. She looked away. Why? He paused. Because I had to stop hiding behind stone. Silence stretched between them like a tightrope neither dared cross. I stepped down from the Wycliffe shipping board, he said. Permanently. And I donated the remainder of Eleanor's dowry to the Women's Artist Trust. Vivian turned back to him slowly. Why are you telling me this? He looked at her, not with demand but with clarity. Because I spent too long preserving what was gone, grieving what never truly belonged to me. And because this time, I want to see the living. Their eyes met then, and in that moment, nothing else existed. No museum walls, no spectators, no past. Only two souls who had known silence, who had survived fire, and who now stood at the threshold of something unnamed. Vivian exhaled. Her gloved hands hung motionless at her sides. She could not speak. She did not need to. Jonathan extended his hand, not in possession, not in plea, only in offering. She looked at it for a moment, and then without hesitation she placed hers in his, and the world, with all its noise and judgment, faded into the stillness of the marble halls. Two hearts, once carved in stone, now beat quietly, fiercely, in the light of something new. It was late May when the gates of the Wycliffe mansion opened once more, not to mourning, not to marble silence, but to light and scent, and the vibrant murmur of life returning. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the garden that wrapped behind the grand stone house on Fifth Avenue was made ready to receive guests. Not for spectacle nor society's approval, but for something quieter, something new. The wrought iron archway, long neglected by footfall, now gleamed beneath the morning sun. White rosebuds coiled along its curves, and patches of freshly laid gravel crunched softly beneath the soles of well-dressed shoes. Laughter floated among the hedges, tentative at first, as though uncertain whether it belonged here. The air was warm, touched with jasmine, and the subtle sweetness of blooming lilacs. In the center of the garden, where once had stood a statue of Eleanor Wycliffe rendered in white marble, elegant and untouchable, there now stood something altogether different. Bronze, a seated woman. Not draped in Greco-Roman robes, not gazing skyward like some mythic muse, but real, alive in form and spirit. Her posture graceful, one hand cradling a sketchbook, the other holding a piece of charcoal mid-stroke. The expression on her face was contemplative, observant, not of the heavens but of the world in front of her. Vivian. Whispers moved through the garden like a breeze. Some recognized her immediately, though her name remained unspoken. Others needed only one glance at the sculpture to connect the lines of bronze to the living woman who stood several paces behind it, dressed in a gown of soft sage green, a wide-brimmed hat casting delicate shadows across her cheekbones. She stood in silence, her gloved hands gently folded, watching the guests as they slowly gathered around the sculpture. She had not wanted a ceremony. She had asked Jonathan for nothing. And yet she knew what this moment meant, not just to him, but to them both. The press had arrived, of course. They always did. But this time they did not write in scandal. The early editions of the society columns carried words like courageous, unexpected, and a bold act of defiance against grief. Some praised the composition of the sculpture, created by a promising young artist from Boston and commissioned in secret. Others speculated about the deeper meaning, the replacement of marble with bronze, the weight of what had once stood in its place. But no one questioned the presence of the woman beside it. Jonathan emerged from the east colonnade just as the sun cleared the rooftops. He wore a tailored morning coat of deep gray, his hair brushed back, his expression composed but open. There was no haste in his step, no apology in his demeanor. As he approached Vivian, the crowd seemed to fade around them. He offered his arm not out of obligation, not as a formality, but as a gesture of shared truth. Vivian looked at him for only a second before placing her hand lightly in the crook of his elbow. They walked together, slowly, past the flower beds of wild hyacinth and peony, through rows of manicured hedges now bursting with fresh green leaves. The guests parted as they passed, some lowering their heads with respect, others holding their gazes a moment longer, perhaps still trying to understand how love, once buried in grief, had found its way back to light. "I wasn't certain you would come," Jonathan murmured. "You asked," she replied simply. He turned his head slightly. "Are you angry with me for doing this?" Her lips curved faintly, eyes scanning the bronze folds of her likeness. "But I still don't believe I belong in gardens." He looked down at her with quiet warmth. "You don't. You belong in studios and rooftops, in places where light has meaning." Vivian's breath caught softly, "And yet here I am, rooted in bronze." "You're not an ornament, Vivian. You're a beginning." They stopped in front of the sculpture once more. From this angle, the resemblance was startling, not just in feature, but in presence. The artist had captured not just her face, but her stillness, her focus, her refusal to be anything less than herself. Jonathan reached for her gloved hand and gently laced their fingers together. "I had to let go of marble," he said quietly. "It was never meant to hold the weight of love, only memory." Vivian turned her face to him. "And what do you carry now?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips and brushed a kiss across the back of her glove, a gesture that echoed nothing of ownership, only reverence. And in that moment, Vivian understood. They would never be what society expected. There would be no grand announcements, no titles bestowed, but they would walk forward together. Later that afternoon, when most of the guests had departed and the garden had quieted, they remained. She removed her gloves and sat on the edge of the fountain, her fingers trailing the surface of the water. Jonathan stood nearby, watching her with the gaze of a man no longer haunted by his past. "I was once carved from stone," he said softly. "Now I feel everything." Vivian smiled, her eyes shining. "And yet you are still standing." He stepped toward her and offered his hand once more. She took it, rising, her fingers curling around his. Together they walked beneath the rose-covered archway, past the last whispers of the day into the golden hush of late afternoon. There were no declarations, no orchestras, no applause, only the quiet rhythm of two hearts choosing one another. And so, with the marble gone, with the snow melted, and the silence finally broken, the garden bloomed again, not with statues of the past, but with the quiet, enduring proof that even a heart carved from stone can choose to beat for the living. New York, spring of 1910. The city had changed. The skyline reached higher now, glass and steel growing where brick and stone once stood. Electric lights illuminated the avenues, and motor cars chugged noisily alongside horse-drawn carriages. Women in wide hats and pastel skirts hurried along the sidewalks with typewritten pages in there, bags and purpose in their steps. The world had tilted forward, and with it society itself. But behind a tall iron gate on Fifth Avenue, set back from the noise and bustle, the Wycliffe Garden remained untouched by time. The bronze statue still stood in the center, aged now by a decade of sun and rain, but no less alive in presence. The woman seated with a sketchbook, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the viewer, had become a quiet symbol in the city, of transformation, of remembrance, and of a different kind of legacy, not one born of marble or mourning, but of choice. Inside the mansion, a warm voice echoed through the hall. "Lucien, where's your satchel, darling? We'll be late for the gallery." A boy of 11 came bounding down the stairs, charcoal smudges on his fingers, his jacket buttoned crookedly, eyes too much like his father's. "I left it in the conservatory," he called, breathless. From the study, a soft laugh. "Of course you did," came the deeper voice, measured, calm, and unmistakably familiar. Jonathan Wycliffe, now in his early 60s. sat in a leather chair surrounded by open letters, sketches, and museum correspondence. His hair had gone fully silver at the temples, and he wore spectacles now, though he often forgot where he left them. Time had refined his presence rather than diminished it. He still commanded attention, but not with force, with gentleness, with presence. And beside him, leaning against the window pane, stood Vivian. She was unchanged in spirit, though the years had left their quiet traces, fine lines near her eyes from laughter and long hours spent painting under lamplight. She wore no corset now, no social armor, only a linen blouse speckled with paint and a soft, knowing smile. They had not sought to conquer society after all that had happened. They had simply outlived it. When the scandal faded, as all scandals do, and the city's gaze turned elsewhere, they had remained, not in defiance, but in devotion. In the garden, in the gallery, in each other's silences. They had married quietly the following spring with only a handful of witnesses beneath the blooming archway of roses. No newspaper carried the announcement, no pearls, no lace, just a simple ceremony. And love earned, patient, unwavering. They never sought children, but Lucien had come into their lives unexpectedly, left orphaned by distant cousins in France after a tragic accident. Jonathan, ever cautious, had hesitated. Vivian had not. She had held the boy's hand and said, "This house was once a museum of ghosts. Let's give it a future." Lucien had her fire and his quiet strength. He painted in the mornings, read aloud in the evenings, and made up stories about the statue in the garden, claiming she could come to life under a full moon. No one corrected him. Mrs. Langford had long since retired to the coast. Cornelia Ashcroft, once the whispering voice of propriety, had died alone in a Boston boarding house, estranged from nearly everyone. Her bitterness, once so potent, had faded into irrelevance. The city barely remembered her name, but Vivian's name endured in galleries and essays and quiet circles of female artists who passed her story like a torch. She had become something more than muse, more than scandal, more than survivor. She had become a symbol. One afternoon, as the cherry blossoms bloomed in Central Park, Vivian stood in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Inside, an entire room now bore her name, the Rousseau Collection of Modern Women's Portraiture. Young artists wandered those halls with sketchbooks in hand, tracing the lines of progress forged not by titles or fortunes but by resilience. Jonathan met her there, always arriving a few steps behind, letting her stand in the light she had once shied away from. "I saw Lucien's new piece," he said that evening as they walked home beneath a sky flushed with violet. "It reminds me of your early work." Vivian smiled, slipping her gloved hand into his. "Then he'll need better brushes." He laughed softly, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand, a gesture as familiar as breathing. In the garden, the bronze figure watched over the flowers. The guests no longer whispered. There were no more rumors, no more columns. Just a boy's laughter, the turning of seasons, and two hearts that had weathered fire. Scandal and silence, still walking forward, still holding on. Love, when chosen freely, does not fade. It endures. Quiet, fierce, true, sometimes. The deepest love stories are not born of fireworks, but of patience, courage, and second chances. The Tycoon Who Chose to See the Living is more than a tale of romance. It is a journey through grief, silence, and the quiet rebellion of a woman who refused to be invisible, and a man who at last learned to open his heart. Let this story remind us that it's never too late to start over, that dignity cannot be stolen, and that real love or not given can bloom even in the coldest winters. If this story moved you, please write the word sketchbook in the comments. That way we'll know you stayed with us until the very last word, and it helps this channel grow, reaching more people who, like you, believe in the power of beautiful stories. Don't keep this emotion to yourself, share it with someone who still believes in love that heals. And if you're new here, I invite you to explore the other unforgettable romances I've left in the cards. Thank you for joining me. Until the next story.